Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to all the people here in the room. It's really wonderful to see you, and welcome to all of the people that are joining us via Zoom. It's really wonderful to have you all join us for this 8th Ethnographic Salon at the Ethnography Studio, now at USC. We had a wonderful workshop this morning with a number of students that came from Canada, all the way to Northern California, to Irvine, who were working and thinking together with us and with Shannon in relation to maps and how might we think with and through maps. And this afternoon we have the Roundtable that is the second part of the Ethnographic Salon that we do every year. And it really is my pleasure to welcome two fantastic scholars and great human beings that I've had the pleasure of meeting in this work. But before I do the formal introductions, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. First, I wanted to send a shout out to our colleagues at Emerge. Emerge is a collective project that brings together ethnography studios, labs, and centers at 5 different universities. And this event this year is in cooperation with our colleagues at Emerge. I also wanted to thank the anthropology department and the School of Social Sciences at USC for supporting the studio, and Katie Ulrich, who is the person that helps lead intellectually and also in terms of labor, all of the things that we do at the studio. So thank you to all of those people and institutions. And so what we have prepared for today is about an hour of conversation around a set of questions that I have prepared for our guests, but hopefully we'll also receive some questions from our colleagues and friends on Zoom and from people here in the room. And so feel free to think about your questions or comments so that we can have a conversation between all the parties involved. And so formally, let me introduce our guests. Let me begin with Professor Shannon Mattern, who is the Penn Presidential Compact Professor of Media Studies and History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania. Shannon's dad owned a hardware store and makes beautiful furniture, and her mom was a special education teacher. Before coming to Penn, or going to Penn, Shannon worked between 2004 and 2022 in the School of Media Studies and the Department of Anthropology at the New School, and collaborated regularly with Parsons School of Design. She also won, importantly, the New School's Distinguished University Teaching Award, and I think this speaks to the investment that Shannon has, both in research and in pedagogy and teaching. Shannon's currently working on research and creative projects that examine how furniture design structures our engagement with media and our performance of intellectual labor. She's thinking about how trees have supplied both raw material and conceptual models for our media and computational technologies, and how we might creatively reimagine various genres of didactic or bureaucratic media, from field guides and repair manuals to slide decks and toolkits. We also have Professor Annette Kim, who is Associate Professor at the Sol Price School for Public Policy here at USC. She is also the director of SLAB, the Spatial Analysis Laboratory at USC's Price, that advances the visualization of the social sciences for public service through teaching, research, and public engagement. Annette also holds a courtesy appointment at the Roski School of Art and Design. Her research experiments with ways to recover data of overlooked peoples and phenomena by incorporating fieldwork and humanities knowledge into spatial analysis. She utilizes critical cartography and spatial ethnography to reconceptualize contemporary urbanism and find more inclusive and humane ways to design and govern in the 21st century city. She has also researched the development of real estate markets and the reformation of property rights in transition countries in Eastern Europe and Asia. And so please join me in welcoming our guests for today. So as I mentioned, I had prepared a few questions to get our conversation going. And since we've been thinking about maps and considering the role that maps play in our lives and in other people's lives, I thought that the first question maybe is a little bit of a loaded question because what I wanted to ask is, as map users and map makers, what are the things that you love about maps? And maybe start with Annette.
Start with me? Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I feel honored to be in the ethnographic group. Anthropology. I feel like I'm a wannabe coming in from the public policy school, but we sorely need it, and that's how I've come to learn in it. Okay, why I love maps is it's a site for finally bringing together my art side and my, I'd say my social science side, public engagement side. So the map can bring both the art and the science. For me, now, the way I think of it is that I have a lab space as a data analysis, collaboration, and then I have a studio space for creativity and emotion and sensory experiences. So the map can encompass all of that. And so for me, finding the map was really so liberating because I didn't have to stay within the disciplinary confines as well as the phenomenon I was interested in. It was hard to be contained in our traditional disciplines. And I think I just love that they're visual. So they can bring the intellectual cerebral side. A lot of times there's something data about it or information. It's a little different maybe than a traditional, let's say painting or something. There's stuff going on, but it can also be so aesthetic and effective, and so it just allows for so many things. So I use the word map writ large, and so it's included things like videos or art installations, or now I'm thinking about the way I write could be a map. So it's big enough to encompass that.
Yeah, that's great. We saw that this morning with the different uses that students are given to the notion of the map, and the map as a product, the map as a transitional space for thinking, the map as the first approximation into something. But I really like the way you speak about an inviting space where a lot of things can happen simultaneously.
Well, and I guess I'd say the map also, it basically paints a picture of a situation that can be synthetic of a variety of things. And for me, one way to use maps is wayfinding to help you find your way, but I realize my maps aren't helping me find someplace, but it's to document how I'm seeing a situation. Yeah, so it's
a clear point of view from the beginning, I guess, situated understanding.
Well, I'm trying to understand through the map making. So I don't have a vision and then I do it. It's a very iterative process, and I'm trying to learn from the map. And sometimes the realization comes after or as I'm going along. So that's enough for me.
Okay, and then for me, I'll just speak about it from research side and then a teaching perspective. For in terms of my research, a lot of my work is about how public institutions manifest themselves or mediate their identity to the publics who both design them, fund them, use them, etc. And I'm always thinking about how these institutions have multiple or myriad interfaces that ideally map onto each other. And here I'm using map kind of in a more capacious metaphorical sense, but sometimes in a literal sense too. So a public library, an archive, a post office, whatever the case may be, how does the manifest itself in a physical form, which is ideally a building building that is legible to a population, both to invite it in so they understand how to use the physical space itself, so that they can access the resources they need. How does it then manifest itself through wayfinding devices, through a digital interface, through a library catalog? So a lot of my work has been with public libraries over the past 20 years, which in order to render themselves legible and usable to a population, ideally have these multiple points of entry that in an ideal situation map onto each other. I've also done a lot of work at like public design processes, so how publics are invited into community design processes, and maps are often an interesting point of entry, which we assume in some cases are legible to everyone, but not everyone knows how to read or make sense of a specialized map produced that kind of includes technical or construction knowledge. You're just thinking about maps as mediated forms that have particular epistemological claims they're making. So that's how it's been important to my research and practice. In terms of teaching, I think it's a really great, as someone who's come from media studies and had forays in design and anthropology and a bunch of different fields, it's a really great case study for students to see, especially if you think capaciously about what a map can be. That I'll just mention that one of the biases in media studies is that typically a lot of media studies programs are called cinema and media studies, or film and media studies, which always privileges film and cinema. So I really want to help students to think like, yes, you come in wanting to make videos or movies, but let's think about the affordance of different media formats, when audio might be better, or when a zine might be better. So I think maps are a great case study, also a capacious realm in and of itself, to help people think about the various mediated forms in which spatial information or spatial experience can be communicated. So that's just a really great way to encourage people to think across these different affordances and limitations of formats. And then I'll also, I've been teaching various, I'm not a cartographer, kind of self-taught, have collaborated with a lot of GIS specialists and programmers, but just learning from them over the past 15 years, I've realized that in my mapping classes, we tend to have students from 12 or 15 different disciplines coming together. Everybody from sustainability management to urban planning to media studies to a bunch of different fields, sociology, anthropology. It's a really great way to have students concretize a research subject, whether they regard themselves as more fluent in visual or verbal communication. For those who are more used to writing, encouraging them to think about mapping out the relationship between concepts, or to think about the specific geographic specificity, site specificity of their field site, for instance, or those that are more visual. It's often a great way to try out ideas, to map out ideas that then offer a port of entry into the writing process. So it's just been a great place for interdisciplinary exploration, recognizing that methodology in particular combines database methods, really thoughtful thinking about designing methodologies, and then artistic modes of expression as well. So it's just a really nice pedagogical space that lies at the intersection of multiple fields.
I love this idea of thinking about the map as a portal and an invitation that moves you from one place to another, regardless of what is that place that you're starting with. Mm-hmm. I know that for me, that actually has been very, very important in my own thinking. What happens if I go through the door of the map and think cartographically or spatially, or following the mapping imagination when thinking about a problem as a person that comes primarily from a textual background.
Well, it makes me realize, I think Kevin Lynch has been often attributed to the idea of a cognitive map, because he had people draw out what was in their heads, but really all maps are, cognitive maps, so they're portals into how you're viewing the world, right? What you notice, what you see. So.
And as you said, portals into change as well, because you figure out things as you develop the map. Mm-hmm. So I think at this point in time, let's say, there's been a robust and extensive critique of map making because of its colonial, exclusionary, and oppressive histories. And we now have a variety of tools and concepts that help us think about map making maybe in a more generative or justice-oriented way. And yet at the same time, there's always something that is reductive in the good sense of the word about map making. There are certain exclusions that you have to effect so that you can work with maps, or so that we can activate this cartographic imagination. So I'm wondering how you think about this tension between the ambition and the desire of producing generative creative maps and the intrinsic exclusions that are part of the process of creating some sort of map in relation to what moves you in the world. And maybe Shannon, do you want to get started with that?
I'd say that the several decades long tradition now, and then if we look at indigenous traditions, probably several centuries, if not millennia long tradition of providing a cartographic alternative to the colonial map. There we see the reductiveness or reductivity, whatever the word is, whatever the noun, the reductiveness of the map that is really prioritizing kind of state boundaries, reifying maps as representations of property, all of these kind of Western notions of how space is parceled up and optimized for productivity, for representations of power. If we look at this much broader, longer tradition, we recognize the reductiveness of the map is often a thing to push against. It shows us the limitations, the paucity of the ontologies of space it makes possible. And especially if we expand the genealogy, the archaeology of cartography is a much broader process. I also think there's something, again, I'm talking about like public design processes. You mentioned that one of my longer term projects is looking at kind of bureaucratic and didactic media, like slide decks. I just published a piece last week about the history of the repair manual as a creative form. And what happens if you take something like a map to address a public urban planning project, or you take a repair manual to address things like reparations writ large. You would say that is criminally reductive. At the same time, it provides a port of entry. It gives people, especially for a really fraught, overdetermined concept where it might be so historied and murky that people don't know how to even begin having a conversation about it. Because of its necessary reductiveness, people are going to feel excluded, not represented. I don't see myself on that map. There's something kind of way too easy about having 5 steps to address this issue in this repair manual. And that's a great thing, to have people, to invite people to feel excluded, or to appreciate the necessary reductiveness, because it gives people something to push up against. And it also gives it's a boundary object in the Susan Lee Starr term. It's something that most people have some sense of legibility, at least elementary legibility, to be able to see, like, I recognize this is the place we're all gathered right now. So it gives us something for people to rally around with their different disciplinary knowledges, personal experiences they're bringing to the table, to then address its inherent reductiveness to generate a larger discussion.
Right. So it's always, I very much appreciate what you're saying about the map in place amongst people in communities. So a map not as the thing that you hang behind you on an office, right? But as the thing that has these communities around them, contested communities at times, of course.
And this is when you think about maps as media, you realize it's not just a reified static object that lives by itself and has to speak by itself. A map on a table that people then talk around, that is a part of the map as a broader medium. Those paratexts, those conversations, that process that led to it is a part of its kind of, the map is a process rather than a product.
Right. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, I think that's how I started getting into maps, was this energy around critical cartography that was emerging in the geography discipline, counter cartographies happening in practices in communities. So yes, there's that very heavy history from the 1600s of how we map now, funded by colonial expeditions, trying to locate their territories. But the people have been using that as a launching point to assert, no, we are here, that there's other ways to, other things to map and other ways to map. And so that's been so energizing for me. That's why I said we could make our own maps, and that there's a lot of lay map making that's happening that's been so fun to see. And I think the first generation, I call it critical cartography 1.0, is to say, yes, there's power issues with the map. And then 2.0 is there's just been a lot of lay map making, which is great. And I think that's my search and research, is how else could we map? And so I partner with community-based organizations who want to make their own maps. And there's been a lot of, in the literature, wondering, can GIS be qualitative? Is it, with the ontology of point, polygons, and lines, is it hopelessly reductive in how it's thinking about space, and people have debated that, and so I've been trying to experiment. How far can we push it? Can that just be a signifier for something else? That it's more qualitative, and then moving to the cinematic map. How can we push against Cartesian ways of thinking of space, the pinning down, emphasizing borders, space as it's static, reified objects, and realize no, space is a very complicated relationship that keeps moving, which is why I like this seminar you put together, Slippery Maps. So how can we push that? And so then I started experimenting with what I call cinematic maps, and moving image maps, and that can go scale and have other senses and challenge our ideas of space and spatial relationships. So I think what I said, to then acknowledge our own power position as the new map makers who we thought were speaking against power, and just realize we're in the web of relationships too. So to acknowledge your limited understanding. So it's starting to make blurry maps. This is the part I feel like I know something about and I don't know over here, to not be the master map maker. So these are the ways I'm searching and trying to move against colonial ways of thinking of mapping. But it's ongoing, and that's what makes it interesting.
So maybe with that, would you tell us a little bit about an ongoing project that you're working on that is taking this idea of more exciting and justice-oriented forms of map making forward?
There's several. I guess my latest ones are to do interactive maps, which I didn't really like actually interactive design of it before, but what it has allowed is the map reader to play a role in what they're bringing to the fore. So one very complicated map project has been to try to make an indigenous map of the LA region. And so you have to collaborate with different tribes and submission Indians who don't agree. And just the whole notion of how do you even map these places? Because the people were moving and they're interacting. They had names for each other's settlements, and so whose names do you put on? And so with the latest state is, and I've gotten approval for most of them, is I decided to just map names and not have any points or boundaries. There's a name on the land. People have called it a place. And I've been really thinking a lot about language and mapping and how places are made through naming through words, and different cultures name it different things over different seasons. And we have this opacity layer that, but why I made it is because I wanted to kind of rehabilitate our cognitive map of the LA area as the freeways, the ocean, the mountain, and to put this is. When I started making this, I hadn't realized there's so many settlements and so many different language groups. Like the wokeness thought, okay, there's Tongva, and Yanga is downtown LA, but actually there's many, many more. And to have it go over the contemporary LA map that's more Google-like, and to realize to slide it over with a different view is something I've been working on, and just the difficulty of mapping and it not being colonial when you're talking about indigenous places, how to do that. So it's been very complicated.
Thank you. How about you, Shannon, in terms of maps and recent work that you've been doing? How do they figure in what you've been working on?
Well, this might not sound very exciting, but I just starting a new job and realizing there are all kinds of there's an institutional organizational chart that I have to become familiar with to recognize what new forms of partnerships I can I can carve out or map out, and how budgetary restrictions kind of limit those things, scheduling systems. This is, again, not exciting, but I would love to do more interdisciplinary mapping projects. But because I'm in a new institutional context in a new city, or I'm having to build new community partnerships, a lot of the techniques and collaborations I had before don't map directly onto the new context. And that's where even my collaboration processes, methodologies for community engagement are not things that are easily ported from one space to another, because there are such site-specific contexts that you have to take into consideration. So part of that is realizing that living in a new map requires new techniques of mapping out new potential partnerships. So it's multiple layers of exciting and not so exciting mapping that has to happen to figure out what my new what role cartography will play in my new research and creative projects I'm able to do in this next chapter of my career.
Right. Yeah.
Can I add?
Yes, of course.
Because you asked me the social justice, like, why am I making an Indigenous map when I'm not Indigenous? I just wanted to clarify that my map project points to each tribe's own website and their own mapping. So it's I think of it as a scaffolding, and so I'm working with public school teachers who now have a California state mandate to learn American cultures and ethnic studies. All kids are supposed to have that. But what I found with the teachers is there's not a lot of, they're kind of struggling of how to incorporate it into their classroom. And my main thing is, here in California, all the kids have to learn the mission project in 4th grade, and it's kind of like a fairy tale land, like it has no relationship to them today. And so that's the limited role I saw me playing, was we are on Indigenous land, like to understand the connection of where you are and how you see your landscape with a whole variety of groups, and then to point them to them, who narrate themselves on their own terms. But I wanted to do the part to connect where you think you are today, the scaffolding to learn about what groups are speaking for themselves, right? So I'm not mapping on their behalf, but it's like a stepping stone. And also to work in collaboration with them. They've corrected my map a lot. And so I just wanted to add that part.
Thank you. So one of the things that we've been discussing this morning, and that is kind of challenging in working with and through maps, is how to deal with things that are constantly changing as we engage in mapping exercises. From sidewalk life to changing geophysical features, to the things that people put in maps because they want to conjure into existence, right? Like in your piece, like the wife's map story. So we've been talking this morning about how to deal with this issue of changing matter, or things that are in transformation when you're working in mapping projects. And so I was wondering if you have any suggestions or anything that comes to mind when dealing with this problem of changing worlds when you're engaged in when you are engaged in a mapping exercise.
Do you want to go first?
Okay. So the process, how to deal with it, and this is why I started going more and more into anthropology, because in the kind of maps you're saying in urban policy issues, they're very kind of static, this is the facts kind of presentation of maps, and it was missing so many things that were really important and key. So how do you get at that? And so I would say my general approach, I call it spatial ethnography. And it's not rocket science, it's basically two things. One, we do the usual research and literature review and that kind of thing, but how important it is to actually go there, to do field work, to physically be in the site and be a part of the social spatial practices and observe, or as best as you can, and then to talk to people who are there, because we come in with our interpretations and lenses, and you can be corrected, you can learn, and of course, we're always in a web of how much can we really understand, but a lot can be corrected by just those two things. Sometimes we've missed so many things that are ubiquitous and right there, if you just went there, that you could make some improvements. So things are always shifting, and we're not sure how to understand what's going on, but I think that's one general approach is, which has been so absent in urban planning, and I think we've both critiqued, especially with this new move to remotely sensed data, big data. It's so easy to just get data about something out there, but not really understand what it's detecting or how it's being strategically generated. Words, social media, they're not a representation of just the facts, I think just that, I just find again and again, you will be rewarded with learning something by doing that process. And so I teach that now in the public policy school to go out and do that. And it always feels a little scary because, we're all like busy people and want to go in with an agenda, but to just be open and try to just be surprised by something is one thing. I think I'll hand it over to them.
Well, you had talked a little bit earlier about the democratization of maps, which is both a good thing and a dangerous thing. The fact that more people can make their own maps, especially with the rise of kind of generally accessible mapping platforms like Mapbox and Carto. I remember when Carto first started, I took my maps class on a field trip to their headquarters, which I think was in Greenpoint, Brooklyn at the time. And they were saying it's fantastic the more people are using our products, but at the same time, there are lots of people who don't really know, don't really have a whole lot of data literacy, dumping data sets, not asking who harvested this data at what time, for what purpose, what point were they trying to make by even asking the questions that generated this data, and then sometimes mashing them up with a different data set that comes with a completely different ideology. So this is where Yanni Loukis's work about all data are local, where it's not only a data set, it actually has a setting as well, a temporal and spatial setting, and a purpose for which it was produced. So recognizing that, I think it's also, I use your book in my class, The Sidewalk City, to represent how we can use multiple media formats, not only to show the different facets of a subject, but also its temporal dimensions. So there are certain media that are called time-based media for a reason. You can use video and audio to really get at the unfolding nature, the evolving nature of a specific spatial phenomenon. There are people who use things like audio tours, encouraging people to walk across different sites as a way your body is actually tracing the contours or the boundaries of a map. You could thinking capaciously about cartography, that counts as a map. Also, even print can be time-based as well. If you know about the history of the Sanborn maps, for instance, which were insurance maps generated, most cities in the country major cities have a set of Sanborn maps. I'm sure Los Angeles has one in the public library. There's only so frequently you can print and update, but what they would often do is send out little cutout pieces that you would then paste onto the map to show where the data has been outdated. So there you're actually using the materiality of print, which by actually, that really calls people's attention to it. If you're flipping through a map and you see a little section that's pasted in on top of a page, that's really gonna call your attention to the fact that this data is actually a fungible thing, that things evolve at a pace faster than the media can update themselves to capture the changing nature of that data. So I think that's a material representation of this really epistemologically valuable friction. So choosing different media formats, putting timestamps on your maps to say this map has a when as well, and then being more conscious of the different temporality of the data that you're then representing on maps or way. And also there are people who specifically are focusing on things like mapping climate change, where they really have to gather or grapple with some of these questions. So how do you maybe use different graphic techniques to show a shifting what's the word I'm looking like? Waterline is the word I'm looking for. There you could use hash marks, shading, all different types of graphic techniques to show the variability You probably have also seen the army maps of the really colorful, beautiful maps. Cartographer's name I'm forgetting. That show the meandering pathways of the Mississippi River. There, that's a beautiful way to use color to show the shifting nature, the slippery nature of something we assume is locked in place, the bed of a river. And then there's a really great book that some friends of mine did called A Moving Border. It was published by Columbia University Press, looking at how the actual political boundaries between Switzerland and Italy and other countries in Southern Europe are really based on mountains with shifting glaciers. So as climate change is actually shrinking these glaciers, the boundaries are shifting too. So this whole map is essentially, this book is essentially a biography of a set of state-produced maps. So that's a way you're actually denaturalizing the map, giving it a biography. And that's a way to capture the story of evolution of a whole set of maps.
Oh, that's fantastic. So on the one hand, being very careful and aware of putting yourself in whatever mediated or unmediated way you can, if there is an unmediated. I'm worried about these words being among media scholars, but. In terms of ethnographic presence and having the possibility of being in a place amongst a community of humans and non-humans, and also thinking carefully about what media afford, and maybe even at some point resisting the urgency to go into certain predictable forms of media to do this.
I'll just add one more thing. Another medium that's not regarded as time-based, is very powerfully in recent history shown changing territories, is just actually I was at a conference at the Columbia with Laura Kurgan's Center for Spatial Research, where I forget his name. He's a computer scientist, used to work for NASA, was really responsible for doing a lot of the maps of Gaza over the past several months, using really interesting kind of oblique imaging technologies to do as accurate as possible representations of edifices that are no longer there. So just seeing these images, a slice of time, 1 month next to another, just on a page of a newspaper, is a really powerful way to show a shifting, it seems like an unfortunate euphemism, but a devastated terrain.
Right.
You brought up, I think you're talking about Anu Mater's work of the Mississippi River and how that was really inspirational for me too, to realize how could you pin down water, and going to your research and just how the colonial expeditions behind it and the Army Corps of Engineers, but of course it's always been fluctuating, the Mississippi River in really big ways, and it's really got me thinking about how do you map things that are living and moving, and so in the sidewalk research I did in Vietnam, when we were trying to map every person and how they're using space in the sidewalk, and one group were like a lot of people camp out and make little cafes with plastic furniture and stuff, but some vendors have to constantly be moving. They can't stop and claim sidewalk space. And I wanted to include them. There's a lot of them. And so what we did in that case in the research is, okay, we'll just use the GIS dot and say they were here within the time we were in this block, we saw someone passing, and just put a dot somewhere. And of course they're moving, and they can't claim a space, but it's important to include them, and so we don't reify that dot as if they were a light pole, but it helps show the power differences between vendors who can camp out sidewalk space and those who have to carry like 20 hats on their heads because they have to keep moving, right? And so to know that you are in charge of your mapping ontology and how you're going to use it. We could use that to count, we could use that to see gender and different things. So I think it gets you to think like, why are things moving? And that's what I was thinking about when you sent the topic, and it's because if they're alive, living things move. And that's really deep, because we're trying to map things that are, if they're alive, they're moving. And usually their bodies, and it gets to the whole, I realized all my projects after looking backwards are I keep generating data of things that were not mapped. And why were they not mapped? Because they were marginalized, and they were a lot of times migrants. The mass urbanization we've gone through at the turn of the century is because people have moved, immigration as well as internal migration, and that's the tectonic shift in human history right now. And part of that map's power is who is part of the polity and has legitimacy for services and that kind of thing. And so it's a important reason why things are moving and not being mapped.
It's also interesting to see where the different temporalities of slipperiness bounce up against each other. So the rate of tectonic shift, where that matches the instantaneity of digital mapping. There are cases where digital maps or GPS systems are actually rendered dysfunctional for a period of time because they're calibrated. I don't know, like you have to read Bill Rankin's book to understand how all of this works, but there are cases where tectonic shifts essentially just move a landscape a bit too far so that it actually renders inoperable for a short period of time the supposedly up to the millisecond systems of GPS related mapping that we're doing. So just the clash of these different temporalities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So your comments make me think about maps that are not visual. So I wanted to ask both of you whether you've encountered maps that are not visual that have been particularly striking, or whether you dream of maps that are not visual, and how might they sound, feel, or not look like, but how might they feel like, or how might they sound like, smell like, as we were talking this morning in terms of some of the student projects.
Well, I'll say, I'm not sure if it's flipped through here, but one of the images here is a burlap map with the country cut out of it with a yarn border around it. That was from an undergraduate student of mine who took a graduate class. Amazing. She was looking at the disappeared, and she was acknowledging that a lot of the local economy was based on coffee. So she chose the burlap sack, evoking coffee, the container that held the coffee, and then used these cutouts as a way of representing the disappeared. So using fabric, textile, there's a whole, as you probably know, tradition for the blind of using tactile maps, which in many public parks will often have a touchable map next to the visual representation. So some of those are not only related to critical disability studies and addressing kind of accessibility of cartography, but also just the different affective dimensions that textiles and other textures evoke. Sound mapping, I mentioned kind of like audio tours, for instance, even music. There are certain, I mentioned to somebody this morning, like I worked in a record store in college and met all of my people that were my friends by hanging out in this record store and organizing shows and doing radio shows and things like that. But just so many of the bands I liked were very specific to a geographic region. There was like the Chicago indie rock scene, the Glasgow indie rock scene. You can kind of hear the space in the sound. Mm-hmm. At least I like to imagine that I could. Mm-hmm. So there's a way that, all people doing like music scenes research can a way like this. The music that has a certain, I don't know, timbre or rhythm or something that is a way that captures the place specificity of the scene that produced it. So that's a very kind of elastic way of thinking about maps, but it's another way that place and sound come together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think sound maps as well. I have an artist friend who's making a sound map right now in Taiwan, and it's ambient sound, but each space has a sound. Mm-hmm. And she's going to all her childhood spaces. It's a way to map her childhood, like her school or old home, and she was, they were telling me they're having some hearing loss, and I said, oh, I'm so sorry, and they're like, no, everyone has different levels of hearing, and that it's really vibrations. They help me think of sound differently, that you're sensing the vibrations, they're mapping that way. I think Hawaiian maps or other like Pacific Islander maps are, it's partly visual, but it's about the wind, and you see the effect of the wind, constellations. So there's lots of possibilities of mapping space.
Mm.
I tend to stay in the visual, but
Yeah, so you're both of you make me think about the question of not only collecting sound but listening, the practice of listening, and how we're familiar with thinking about practices of reading and the cultivation of seeing as a professional, but also cultural practice, but also the question of listening as something that requires the same kind of detailed analysis. So we're going to have time for questions in a moment. So I'm just giving people a heads up. But before we go into that, there's one question that is about the change, not necessarily on that which we wish to map, but the change in ourselves as we engage in research processes and projects. So, we know that maps are produced in response to a particular question or a political program, or even a desire to know certain things about the world. But as those motivations change, because we change and we learn more, and we sometimes change our minds, how might we become more explicitly responsible for those rationalities that we bring to the map making? And how to make them more explicit, sort of in the tradition of the time stamp, so that it is clear when we've moved on from one form of rationality in map making towards another. So I'm thinking about this in relation to us as situated practitioners that also are entitled to change our minds as well, to learn new things and find new forms of approaching the questions that we're interested in. And so the question is really, how do you think about your own change as a person that relates with maps, and how might that be expressed in the map making or in the analysis of maps themselves?
Well, I was trying to figure out this question when you sent it, and I think responsibility, I try to narrate positionality and my limits and the power relationships in my map projects, but the change I've been going through is also, I think there's some slides here where I'm making a different kind of map where it's less rational and some more art, and because there's a whole realm. I got tired of digital all the time, and I wanted material, and I think it coincided with just, I was saying I'm figuring it out, but I'm realizing there's different mode I want to go into. So there's the lab, it's collaborative, there's analytical, it's trying to be socially engaged, work towards justice. I still do all that. I think it's great, but then I needed a different kind of map too. And now I have a studio space, and it's no digital allowed. Mm-hmm. It's material. And there I could be emotional. That's like grief and texture. And I'm making these huge maps that are body size, so your body reads the map. And it's not... it's also about the limits of words, and yet how we all try so much to communicate. So that, I don't know if that's it's just there's a change going on with me. I don't feel responsible. In a way, that's why it was hard for me to do this for a long time. It seemed a little selfish. It's mostly for me, but it's connecting with people. Actually, it's not just it's really meaningful when I connect with people through that way, and it's been very deep and something different, more personal than the other.
Can you describe a little bit more the materiality of the things that you produce?
Yeah, so it first started with collecting ethnic newspapers around LA County. There's so many languages. In my lab research, we found 97 cultures expressing themselves through signage in the city. But then I started making paper collage map scrolls that you could roll up and, take away. And it's an intuitive map making. I just know what the next step is. So it's a completely different process. Right.
I would say, just to your question about the motivation or intention, I'd also like to keep open the possibility that some maps are kind of like accretions. Like if you look at desire lines, for instance, like an urban planner might have a sense of where a sidewalk needs to go across campus, but through years of practice, students will carve a new line in. And transportation planners will often look after a snowfall where people tend to be stepping onto the curb, and they go, it's like, oh, we might need a curb cut here. So it's like the accidental accretions of desire, not rational intention, that produce and maybe make new maps because officials see, oh, this is what people want, and it doesn't map onto what we thought they wanted, so let's actually change the territory that we're mapping. And then another thing that I think has been really useful and enlightening to me through working with students for the past decade or so is a lot of students come in wanting to find the big open data set. We talked about this a bit this morning. So they're doing an urban planning project or an environmental science project, and they want to find a compilation of data sets that they can aggregate to produce a comprehensive map with all kinds of layers you can turn on and off. And then they realize that these data sets don't actually speak to each other because, again, they weren't asking similar or interchangeable or interoperable questions through their production, or they're representing different times, or it's hard to reconcile them because they have different epistemologies and politics built into them. So I think recognizing the fact that there is no comprehensive, complete data set, or to disabuse yourself of the notion that you want, that's even desirable in some cases. Also recognizing that that partiality is in many cases a more accurate representation of how the world works or is, or how people experience the world anyway. So finding ways to represent ambiguity and uncertainty. And I, a couple weeks ago, published this piece in the Journal of Visual Culture called, I forget what it's called, Modeling Doubt, a Speculative Syllabus. And it's about, I was invited to do this keynote about digital humanities, and I was just so annoyed with the hubris of people like Elon Musk and with his, his new AI that's supposed to be a more humane approach to AI, Sam Altman, all these folks. I wanted to think like the hubris that is so pervasive and off-putting. I would like to think about how we can use computational tools to actually model or demonstrate or visualize humility and uncertainty in cases too. So this is something that a lot of my students have had to grapple with, is where is humility not a sign of your deficiency or the fact that you haven't done enough research or done your job, but it's actually a more honest representation of how people experience the world in the inherent messiness and inevitable uncertainty in our lived experience of it. So just finding ways of representing that in chromatic techniques, graphic design techniques, or even just the way we construct infrastructures, building like some intentional imperfections into those as well.
Right. Love that. Thank you so much. So we have time for a few questions at the moment. Maybe we can begin with people in the room in case there are comments or questions that you'd like to pose to our guests. And we also have people know Katie looking at the Zoom questions for our audience online.
Question. I wasn't part of the morning session, so maybe you talked about this. But first, thank you. It's such a generative conversation.
Can you speak?
It's such a generative conversation. I was curious because you kind of mentioned but didn't really discuss the erasure exclusion, or how do you think about the things that can't be mapped and how to grapple with the fact that I was curious about this, like the vendor who was moving, right? That was an effort to map it, but it's kind of partial. But how to think about, just an opportunity for you to reflect on how to think about things that can't be mapped and how to kind of include that on your mapping, although they can't be mapped.
That's such a key question, and I love. I completely agree with everything you said about erasure and humility and partiality, and that's actually more truthful. And so how to, because I'm making maps, so how to acknowledge what I cannot map, right? And usually I do it as like a caption to try to be explicit about the limitations. I saw a really neat way in this other digital humanities project. I was at a Berkeley mapping conference a while ago, and they brought everything into a GIS framework, but everything was partial. And they would put a little percentage accuracy, they thought, for each thing that was on top of each other. So there might be 3 layers of the same thing on top of each other, and they could include watercolor desenyo maps of like where was the tree, which were actually pretty accurate because there weren't that many trees in the California landscape. But they're, you know, watercolor drawings versus like an airplane photogrammetric image versus, you know, at a certain point in time. So for me, I was saying I try to build in blurriness into the map because I really like trying to spread this narrative that it's not bad research. To not have this master map, you know, that has a lot of connotations, the master, you know.
I think also sometimes a map might not be the best way to make the argument or tell the story, which is where all the paratext, why an atlas sometimes has photographs and a text and captions. Sometimes that's the best way to convey if something doesn't lend itself to cartographic representation. Also, there are issues of like redaction. I mentioned this a bit this morning, like a lot of more visual artists, but also sound artists, people working in different media forms have used redaction in really creative ways to show this is a good way to represent refusal. You know, there's the whole concept of indigenous or feminist refusal, where there are certain populations choose not to be mapped because they don't want to be represented on the master's map. Or a friend of mine, Jared Thorpe, who used to run the Office of Creative Research, they work with National Geographic on the Great Elephant Census and found that in that case, actually representing where the elephants lived then renders them ever more vulnerable to decimation. So you refuse to map certain things because granular, on a veracity, high fidelity representation actually is contrary to your aims or draws unwanted attention to population. So that's where refusal can be useful, where you can use blurs or intentional redactions or supplement with text what you don't want to show on a map. So there are all kind of ethical, political, methodological questions that are wrapped into, and some things just, maybe a map isn't the right mode of expression for certain things.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ethics, so you have to be careful how you map. So one of my projects has mapping the million underground units in Beijing. There was all this housing underneath, and there are ads on the internet for where they were. So we scraped the internet and mapped them, but we made each dot like the size of a block, right? And it's more to show it's everywhere, that this whole underground layer exists that we're not seeing above ground. But it was really important not to say down this entrance. And we did that for a number of things. Like people asked me about the ethics of mapping sidewalk life, a lot of it, which was lending. And again, it's like it's everywhere, so it's not, and it's out in the open. And it's just to say we're not seeing it in our policy circle, in our master plan renderings of the city, but it's right there, you know. One really moving project I saw was from a Ukrainian researcher where she mapped the absence of Ukrainian culture after the annexation. So her photographs were of all the holes in the walls where there had hung signs. And it was just so moving, and all the absences is what she was documenting. Right.
Yes.
Yeah, we have one question from our online participant folks audience. Nicole Hernandez asks, what do you think about various types of archival sources like oral histories and photographs as cultural or social maps?
Well, you can use, you're talking about interactive maps before, that's another place to show change. Like interactivity is another one of those potentially time-based media that goes back to your earlier question. But there are cases of people taking different archival materials and photographic, oral history, all types of things, geolocating them on a map. And sometimes it's on a specific point that it applies to. If you're talking about a city at large, the question is like, where do you put the point on the map if you have to attach it to a place? So there are all kinds of interactive maps that use these materials with a base map, but then what do you think about an archival material, or what was the other, photographs? Photographs as maps in and of themselves. Well, archival material can be any type of media format. I mean, you could have maps themselves as archival materials. So they could provide interesting spatial information. I'll give you just one example that might be a little unorthodox. The New York Public Library has a great menu collection. And there they've done, that's one of their early crowdsourcing projects, where a lot of it was in typefaces that OCR couldn't recognize, so they crowdsourced a lot of the transcription project. And there, that became a very great informal map of the movement, again, a slippery territory of ethnic communities around the city, how you can read a lot about like political economy, entertainment cultures, all types of things through menus, which we regard as this gray literature, this very bureaucratic medium. But there's a lot to be read about graphic design history, about ethnic culture, about community, all kinds of things. And they then wanted to, I had some, again, I keep talking about friends, there's not even a billion friends, but I know a lot of these cool people doing cool projects. But they were gonna do this project called the Time-Space Directory, or the Space-Time Directory, where they took all the material across their manuscripts and photography and geolocated it and put it on this base maps that they were based on a lot of their Sanborn and other historical layers of New York City maps. So find a way to be able to search by intersection or by address and see all the things across the collection that pertain to that space, which would have been a really great thing, but then their priorities shifted. But this is a great way to connect, to find a way to, if you want a more literal way of thinking about a map, to take any one of these archival materials and actually connect them to a map through tagging kind of labor. That could be a great way to tell spatial stories through any type of archival medium.
Yeah, with the archive, one of my maps I have up here is a Black placemaking map of the Great Migration to Santa Monica, California. And as part of that, we transcribed the declassified census from 1940 and 50, which is part of the Great Migration and before urban renewal wiped out some of these communities. And so we're like, oh, great, we have all the students working on this every year and we have the data. And then I looked up some of my friends and I'm like, what happened? And now actually the Library of Congress says, help us, or because there's a lot of inaccuracies in the archives, especially when you had communities of color being surveyed by human enumerators. Mm-hmm. And so we ended up having the Black Elder Citizen Science Project, I call it, because they're still alive. And they wanted to be accurate, and so we had this kind of party where they're correcting the census. So just to realize the archive also needs to be critically approached, and just like I'm always suspicious of my data, which is I think been very fruitful because I keep finding systematic issues with them. So trying to locate where those boundaries might be is helpful. But then when we had the data points, it didn't capture why I was doing this is the Black elders whose neighborhood got wiped out were really proud of the thriving community that they had made, so they wanted to convey that, and the dots were not doing it, of a GIS type map. So that's why photographs, stories, sounds, and oral histories are really key, so we're embedding that into the interactive map as well. And what I'm so heartened is that one of my intended users are the next generation, so high school kids. And those are the two things they really liked, was maps where you could explore, like traditional thinking maps or interactive maps, and the oral histories, these short snippets of hearing people speak for themselves. So I think that was very rewarding.
Yeah, this is great. It makes me think. We had this conversation this morning about what do you keep as the ground of your map when you're mapping something. What is that thing that is underneath? And there's a way in which we can think that we always want to reject formal dominant stories, and that's a situated question. Sometimes you actually really want to make yourself present in dominant cartographic stories. But then other times you obviously don't. So returning to this question of the situated suspicion of your own data and the clarity and the move towards always asking why and where are we doing this mapping exercise. So we're a little bit over time, but this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody here, and thank you to people online. It's been really wonderful to have you all.